biblical characters. And I didn't realize when this decision was made to teach this evening that we would be marking the very sad passing of Rabbi Harold Kushner, Zichrono Livracha, who wrote the very well-known book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And so my title, inadvertently, this is dedicated to him, and should just rest in peace. Okay, disclaimer. We're going to start with the story of the Akeda, the binding of Isaac, which is a story that, as long as I live, I will never understand. And it's always a very difficult thing for me as a Jewish educator that the Jewish school year begins in September, when the Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah is this story, and so is expected that we begin the year teaching this story, which I think is probably the worst possible introduction to Bible that we could come up with, because the story is incomprehensible. But what has helped me, not crack it, I never will, but what has helped me to understand it a little bit better is to apply what Rabbi Brass very kindly introduced to you, my theory of the subversive sequel. What has helped me understand it is to look at this difficult story in light of its conversational partner. And when I say this, I'm talking about a kind of vibrant conversation that's going on between passages within the Bible. And I'm going to throw this out to you, even though I'm the one with the microphone. What do I mean by that? How do we know that stories in the Bible are in conversation with one another? What would be our tip-off as good readers to say this story is having a conversation with that story? What are we looking for?
They're using the same language.
Good, the same language, certain vocabulary that's shared between stories. What else? Besides language. Common themes, right? There are certain stories that share sometimes a remarkable number of words and of themes, and it behooves us as careful readers of the text to notice those things and to see them as the equivalent of arrows pointing us from one story to the other, basically telling us that there is a great deal to be gained by looking at these stories as pairs, far beyond what we would have gotten had we viewed them only as individual stories. Where the subversive sequel was born, and the mining and undermining, as I got more and more enchanted with this method, is that stories are in conversation, not just sometimes to one story we elucidate the other, we'll expand on it, we'll interpret it. That's the mining process. Where things get even more interesting is where one story will borrow the language and the themes of another, not just to echo and reinforce it, but to actually begin to undermine it, to challenge its assumptions, and sometimes even to radically overturn its conclusions. And when I started looking at stories like this, in particular the Bible's most difficult stories, it helped me realize that once we read a story and we end up scratching our heads and say, what happened here? We realize that's not the end of the story. This Bible of ours is this incredibly dynamic book where the story seems to be finished, but yet it's picked up again later, right? We find the story that's playing on that one and see, well, what's the next part of that story? And is the story told in a consistent way, or is the story told in a subversive way, where it kind of questions itself and sometimes even begins to reverse itself? That's where the subversive sequel was born. True confession, I was really pleased. Thank you for complimenting my title. It took me a very long time to write this book, and it took me a very long time to come up with this title. And I remember when I finally got it, I came out of my study and I announced it to my family: Subversive Sequels in the Bible, How Biblical Stories Mine and Undermine Each Other. And I remember my youngest son, who was about 16 or 17 at the time, Amitai, he looked at me with this pained expression on his face. He said, Ima, nobody is going to buy a book with that name. You have to call it Monkeys in Space. So, anyway, maybe I should have listened, I don't know, and we will never know. But here we are stuck with this. So let us begin with mining. We're going to start, and you should all have a copy of the source material, at least within your line of vision. We're going to start with the story of the Akeda, the story of, and I know this is a very familiar story, but just to give you the broad outline of the story for a quick reminder, God is going to subject the most loyal servant, God's most loyal servant, Abraham, is called a test. And what is the test? Abraham is told to slaughter his beloved son Isaac. And this command is something that Abraham certainly couldn't comprehend. There's no explanation given for it. And it is, on its face, the most unjust thing that God could have ever demanded of him. And at the end of the story, and it seems from the way the story plays out that what's expected of Abraham is not only to comply with this unjust, incomprehensible order, but also to do it silently, to silently submit. And we see in the story that Abraham is completely, almost like a robot, doing everything that God tells him. And at the end of the story, God gives him the equivalent of a pat on the back. Well done, Abraham. You surrendered yourself to my will. You were ready to do it. There's this last-minute reprieve where the angel comes down and says, don't do it. But God says, good for you. You were willing to do it. And now I know, says God, that you are a God-fearing person. That's the accolade that is given to Abraham at the end of the Akeda. Because you were willing to do this, to submit to this impossible command, I'm willing to call you Yirei Elohim, a God-fearing person. Okay, now it seems, and a lot of people would say, does this story have a happy ending? Well, maybe yes and no. On one level, it has a happy ending, and I would say that first level is the covenantal level, meaning God wants Abraham to do this, Abraham does it, and God says, well done. But on a personal level, and this is where I want to pick up the action on the page in front of you, we have a slightly different story that comes out, and conclusion. It's not a happy ending at all, because there is trauma of all sorts that are caused to this completely innocent man, Abraham, who does nothing but fear God and follow God, and one might argue even more so to this completely innocent son of his, Isaac. What has he ever done, right? And where we get the slightest indication, the story is very tightly packed and it's very hard to tell what exactly is happening. We have to read carefully and between the lines, but let's take a look at it. I would argue that the story leaves us with a sense of trauma for the hero, both on a short-term level and on a permanent level. First of all, let's look at source number one. When God first instructs Abraham to take his son, look how Isaac is described here. The Hebrew is here. Underneath the Hebrew, in each case, the English is there. God says, Kach na et bincha et yichidecha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. How is Isaac described? Your son, your only son, whom you love. Notice at the end of the story, after the reprieve and after he doesn't have to kill him, God says, now I know that here an angel of the Lord called out to him just below, do not cast your hand upon the lad, do not do anything to him, for now I know that you are God-fearing, since you have not withheld, now how is Isaac described? Et bincha et yichidecha. What's missing here? Your son, your only son. What's missing? Asher ahavta. What happened to this descriptor of Isaac as the one whom you love? It seems that somehow from the beginning of this story to the end, somehow that love somehow has gone missing. That's one small hint that something terrible has happened here. Notice also in the next little piece, where when God instructs Abraham to go off with Isaac, Vayomer Avraham el ne'arav. This is the third little piece of Hebrew here. Abraham said to his lads, Shavu lachem po im hachamor. Where Abraham is going to go off with Isaac, he says to these young men who are accompanying him, you stay back here with the donkey. And there's something very comical about this. Stay back with the donkey. And there's wonderful midrashim about this, which claim that chamor, the word chamor, donkey, plays on the word chomer, which means something that's very bogged down by its materiality. You young men who aren't on this spiritual level that we are, you can't share this, you can't go where we're going, you stay behind with that material thing. We're going off to where God wants us to go. I and Isaac, we will go off there. And then the text tells us twice, Vayilchu shnehem yachdav. The two of them went together. Right, so we've got a team of a fierce kind of connection between Isaac and Abraham. They are yachdav. They are going together to this place that only they can comprehend. And who's left behind? These lads who have to stay with donkeys. But look what happens at the end of the story, just below that. After the Akeda, after the reprieve, Vayashov Avraham el ne'arav. This is in the 4th little passage. Abraham returned to whom? To his servants, to these young boys. Vayakumu vayelchu yachdav. They got up and went off together. What's the team now? Not Abraham and Isaac, but Abraham and these young men who were left behind. All of a sudden now Abraham is with them, and where's Isaac? Abraham returned to his lads. Isaac has gone completely missing. Right? So not only is Abraham now shifted from this connection with Isaac, but Isaac is nowhere to be found. And so this gives rise to all kinds of speculation about where he is. But it seems on the simplest level that there is a split that takes place between Abraham and his son, where they're never really reunited after this. Here is a father who was willing to do God's bidding, which included taking the life of his own son. How do they find repair from that? Well, maybe they don't. And so the story, I think, ends, and with a covenantal victory, I think it ends on personal tragedy, perhaps even personal trauma. So in case you weren't confounded enough by this story, I hope I've made it worse. We're left at the end of this story with lots of really fundamental questions. And I'm just going to throw out a few. We could go on all night just with the questions. But the ones that I want to get to in particular is number one, is this really how God has to operate in the world? This kind of cruel tests to test people's loyalty, tests that cause lasting damage. Is God in this always only posturing, right? Did God ever really mean for Abraham to do this? How far would God go with this kind of horrific command? And in the face of God's injustice, does God always require the servant to be silently submissive? Would the servant win the accolade of God-fearing if the servant had something to say? Like, what are you talking about, God? How dare you tell me to do that? Or what do you explain yourself to me? What would have happened if the hero had opened up his mouth? Would he still have been considered to be God-fearing? Okay, we've got lots and lots of questions, and finally the big one, does God ever explain why these things happen? Beyond this, is there ever any hint of an apology for causing these terrible things to happen? Okay, all these questions are left wide open at the end of the Akeda, and we're not going to find the answers in the story itself, but very fortunately for us, we've got a subversive sequel to consider. And where do we find it? If you look at source number 2 on your page, there's a strong hint in the epilogue to the story of the Akeda as to where we need to look. Okay, so if you see it in source number 2 at the bottom of your first page, some really evocative terms. First of all, this is one of the strangest anticlimaxes of all time, right? We've got Abraham who's standing over his son with a flesh-eating knife. He's about to come down and kill him. An angel comes up and says, Abraham, Abraham, don't do it. Phew, that was a close call. And then along comes a messenger to tell Abraham, guess what? Your brother has had a whole bunch of grandchildren. You've got a whole bunch of new grandnephews. That's the end of the story. But if we look more closely at the names that are presented here, we find that these are the arrows out of this story and to its partner that we've been looking for. Vayhi acharei hadevarim ha'eleh, vayugad la'Avraham lemor hinei yalda Milcah, your Milcah has given birth to all these children. And what are their names? Utz, Buz, Kesed, etc. Okay, where are we going to find these words in another biblical story? Anyone want to render a guess? Excellent. The book of Job. That's where we've just got to go. And so, if you look at source number 3 on your page, you will find, first of all, okay, we're introduced to Job, Ish haya be'eretz Utz. This one child that was born, this grandchild that was born to Abraham's brother, whose name is Utz, now becomes the place from which Job originates. Buz is going to be another character, and that's another name in the epilogue. That's going to be a character that we're going to meet later. Elihu, who is called a Buzite. Kesed, another name in the epilogue. There's going to be a group, this group of marauding kasdim, from the word kesed, the plural of the word kesed. We play on that. Notice how Job is described here in the first line. Ish haya ve'eretz utz Iyov shemo, v'haya ha'ish hahu tam v'yashar v'yirei Elohim. How is he described? Tam, what does that word mean? Simple or maybe perfect, whole, and straight, and Yirei Elohim. Okay, any resonance there? God-fearing. This is the accolade that Abraham is given just after the Akeda. Here, when we first meet Job, we're told he's already there. He's Abraham after the Akeda. He is perfect. Tam, and as we're going to see later in the book of Job, the word Tam and Yirei Elohim are going to be used interchangeably, perfect and God-fearing. Okay, and now we've got this very strange story, which we're just going to have to kind of summarize. The Lord said to Satan, have you noticed my servant? Right, here's God having just every casual conversation with Satan and saying to Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? There is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. Okay, in Hebrew we would say, al tiftach pe la satan. Don't open your mouth to the Satan, means don't bring on trouble. This is the first case of literally God opens God's mouth to the Satan, and Satan says, oh yeah, he's so great, let's test him. Okay, again, this test, this time it brought about by Satan, kind of taunting God to say, this guy can't be as good as you think he is. And what is the essence of Satan's argument? Satan says to God, well, sure, he's good. You have blessed his efforts. Everything he's done, he's gotten everything that a human being could possibly want. Everything's going his way. But if you take all those good things away from him, what is he going to do? And here's where the Hebrew has a good time with us. It says, Im lo al panecha yivaracheka. You have blessed him, barech. See if you take that away, if he will not bless you. And this bless has to come with quotes. It's a euphemism for the opposite, which is cursing, blaspheming God. Right? And the text, it's kind of protecting our gentle sensibilities by not using the word curse for God. We use the word bless, understanding that it means the opposite. But here is Satan basically saying the word bless, and I think there's something, the form and the content kind of connect here, where the meaning of the word bless depends on its context. That's how we know what it means, whether blessing or cursing. And what the essence of his argument is, Job's goodness depends on his context, right? If you give him good things, he will bless you. If you give him bad things, he will do the opposite of blessing you. Okay, so that's his argument. And what ends up happening is God says, go ahead, free reign, do whatever you want. And so Satan does terrible, terrible things. And just to summarize it, a Chaldean, here come the Kasdim. They make a raid on the camels. They come running to Job. First, all of his possessions are destroyed. Then, ultimately, the worst thing happens, which is all of his 10 children are having their meal together, and a huge wind comes down, knocks down the house, collapses on them, kills them all. And Job arose and tore his clothing. This is 3 lines from the bottom, just at the end of source 3. And what does he say? Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What kind of blessing does he mean here? The real kind or the euphemistic kind? What? The real kind, right? He doesn't falter. He doesn't fall into the trap, even though he's lost everything. And then the text ends here by saying, B'chol zot lo chata Iyov. He does not sin. Okay, now let's look at what happens in the next section, the next chapter. This time, Satan's not satisfied. Satan says, you haven't really gotten to him. And this is, I think, the most cynical argument that Satan makes. One might argue also that there's something deeply true about it. What Satan says is, you haven't really gotten him yet because you haven't touched his own body. And I was thinking about this, and it's so disturbing to think. I mean, the man has lost his family, he's lost everything. But then I think about sometimes where I could just think of my own life where I've taken care or tried to help look after people who are very ill. And I remember that feeling of you simply cannot compare being with someone who has an illness to having it oneself, where there is no escape. You can't go home at the end of the day. It's right there. Or in a more frivolous way, I think about in Israel, the weather is the only piece of the news that has an ad immediately before it and immediately after it, because that's the thing that people are really going to watch. How am I going to feel in my skin tomorrow? That's really what we want to know, right? And Satan is basically calling him on it and saying, get him where it really hurts, get him in his own skin. And so God says, go ahead, do whatever you want, just don't kill him. And so he strikes him with boils from head to toe. And this time, if you look just at the end of this in source 4, Bechol Zot, look what's happening now. Lo chata Iyov bisfatav. Job did not sin with his lips. What has changed here from the first passage? That at the end of the first passage it said, no, despite all this, Job did not sin, period. Now it says he did not sin with his lips. What does that hint at? What? That maybe what this is telling us is, well, maybe his mouth isn't saying it, but he's already beginning to feel it. Something is beginning to crack within Job. His mind, his soul is starting to push back. And we're kind of bracing ourselves with it. And I think the text is kind of playing with us. After this, it says, Acharechen, this is in source 4. Afterwards, Patach Iyov et pihu. He opens his mouth, and we're holding our breath. Oh no, here it comes. Is Satan right? Vayikalel. And this time we have no euphemism at all. We have curse. But who does he curse? Vayikalel et yomo. He curses himself. He turns it inward. Okay, so he's, in a sense, on the one level, he's proving Satan wrong because he's not going to turn on God. But on the other hand, this is where the subversive sequel to the Akeda is born. That right now, Job, unlike Abraham, who is this stalwart, as Kierkegaard famously said, knight of faith, this silently submissive soldier of God, he remains silent throughout. Here, Job opens up his mouth, and what we're going to find now for 38 chapters in a very extensive set of monologues is just volumes of verbiage that are torrents of words that are going to spill out of Job and everybody else in this story. Okay, so now again, we're holding our breath. What's he going to say? And when he says it, is he still going to be able to hold on to this status of God-fearing with which he began? What's going to happen to this guy now that his mouth has been unleashed? Okay, you ready for this? Let's go on. Let's go now to source number 4. Is that right? 5. Thank you. Yes. Here is Job in one of his monologues. It seems that he is about to lose his perfection, his simplicity, his God-fearingness. He's going to doubt God's justice in what seems to be the most blatant and accusatory fashion. He cries out to God, Hen etzak Hamas. Where have we heard that word? I call Hamas, violence. Okay, yes, there is a modern movement called Hamas that is very much related to this, but that's a coincidence. Hamas is a word that's used in the story of the flood to describe the evil to which humanity has descended, and that's what seals the fate, where God says, they're so filled with Hamas, I have to destroy them. Who is Job accusing of being a practitioner of Hamas here? What? God. I call Hamas God, and I am not answered. Ashavea ve'ein mishpat. I shout, but I can get no justice. Right? The story, I think the quintessential story of the absence of justice in the book of Genesis, Rabbi Browson alluded to it earlier. Abraham in where? What's the city that doesn't have justice? Sodom, right? He's basically turning to God and saying, these symbols of injustice, the generation of the flood and the people of Sodom, you, God, are the one now who is perpetrating those injustices. He's screaming at God and saying, God, I accuse you. And lest we turn it against Job, Job says, don't tell me I did anything wrong. It can't be me. And if you look on your page, Job 31, he says the most incredible thing. He says, let God weigh me on the scale of righteousness. Let God ascertain my blamelessness. Tam. He says, I'm Tam. Don't tell me I did anything wrong. And then he goes on to say, did I deny the poor their needs or let a widow pine away? Okay, and there's a big discussion in the Talmud about whether Job was a real person or whether he's an invention. And there's a very strong tradition that says there is no such person, because who could ever stand up and say with such certainty, I've never done anything wrong. There's never been a widow or an orphan who has been left unclothed because of me. I take care of everybody. We set up this kind of device to say, here is a perfect man, and God is attacking that perfect man with complete injustice. And Job stands up and says, I cry foul. Along come Job's friends, and they say, that can't be. God is justice. And if you look at the next source, here is Eliphaz making the following claim. Halo yiratcha kislatecha. Is not your fear of God your confidence? Okay, what does he mean by this? If you're really God-fearing, you've got nothing to worry about because God will take care of you. Is not your blamelessness, and again, equating yirah and tom, is not your blamelessness your hope? Think now, what innocent man has ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? What's he saying? How can there be, right, the way that it's often termed tzaddik v'ra. How can there be a righteous person and bad things happen to him? How could bad things happen to good people? What is this friend of Job basically claiming?
He must have done something wrong.
There's no such thing. If God is justice and something bad is happening to you, there's only one possible explanation, which is it's not that the bad isn't bad, it's that the tzaddik, the righteous person, isn't really a righteous person. It's you, says this friend. So we've got this two-sided argument here. Job refuses to accept this. Okay, and then we get to Job 38 in source number 7. And I'm going to ask you to take a minute, look at this on your own for a minute. Just going to pretend this is a Pardes Beit Midrash, which God is now going to speak from the storm and say something of great import to Job. Who is God siding with? Which argument? That of Job or that of Job's friends? Please read source 38 for a minute. Talk to the person next to you. Who's God? What's the answer in this book? Yeah.
He's saying, you can't understand what God's doing.
Okay, so is that more like Job or more like Job's friends?
I'm sorry?
Is that more on the side of Job's argument or on the side of the friend's argument?
You lost me because my attention was riveted. I'm just trying to understand what you were saying.
Okay, fair enough.
What my take away?
Okay, basically, yeah.
You can finish the thought, sorry.
No.
There's lots I could say what's foremost in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, well, you may think you're blameless, but look at all of what I did. It's kind of in the reverse order. I did all this. Like, there might have been a time that you didn't have such a good day.
Okay.
You just don't remember.
Okay. And basically, I mean, it's even more than that. God almost gets more personal with him in saying, what are you anyway? Right? Who are you to be questioning me, to be challenging me? That's the essence of what God is saying here. First of all, the setting of it, the staging of it. I'm in LA, let's talk about staging. The staging of it, where the Lord answers from a tempest, right? I need the sound and light show, where we've got this wind and sounds and noise and everything else. And then God's booming voice, who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. Have you ever commanded the day to break, assigned the dawn its place? God's argument is, it's a very ad hominem argument, isn't it? It's like, I'm God and you're not, so just be quiet, right? You're nothing, says God. And it seems that that is more in line with what the Friends are saying, which is God is justice because God is so great that you can't even begin to fathom what God is. God, this is this ultimate put down to say, I don't even deign to have a conversation with you because you're nothing. And it seems that this is, right, we put this whole thing to rest. The Yirei Elohim, you want to remain God-fearing? Act like Abraham. Just continue Abraham's actions as he was at the Akeda. I tell you something, I boom it out to you, you accept it, keep quiet, just follow the orders, accept injustice as God's will, and don't ask questions about it, because if it's God's will, then it is, by its very definition, just. And that's all there is to it. Okay, and that seems to be the end of the book, except it isn't. Okay, first of all, what is Job's response to this? If you look just below it in Job 42, Vaya'an Iyov et Hashem vayomar. He answers God and says, Al ken em'as v'nichamti al afar va'efer. Therefore, I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. By the way, talk about an Abraham reference. There are only two biblical characters who refer to themselves as dust and ashes. Guess who the other one is? No? Abraham. Abraham. Again, he is the Abraham character. And he's saying, I'm nothing, right? God, I accept your argument. You have overwhelmed me, and I accept my insignificance. Nichamti, this wonderful, very flexible verb, linnachem, can mean a lot of things, but what does it mean? What does it mean here? Nichamti means I recant. I regret. I'm wrong. I was wrong. You were right. I'm going to do what you said and just shut up now. Okay, that seems to be the end of the book. Okay, but what is so fascinating about this book, but we'll get to, wait, one second. I just want to say that the idea of reinforcing the night of faith, when I was reading this and really getting into it, I was reading this amazing book by James Kugel called In the Valley of the Shadow. Has anyone ever seen this book? Really an incredible book. And he wrote it just after he himself had undergone a terrible, life-threatening illness. And he says that there is in general, there's this desperate human need to feel a sense of control, a sense of security in life. But all of that sense of control and security is really an illusion. And he has this wonderful chapter. He gives these really cute little headings. And one of them is, man stands in front of an elevator pushing the button. And when you think about how ridiculous this is, where you're standing in front of an elevator and the button and it's lit. And what do? Why do we do that? The elevator's not going to come in. I'm sorry if I'm divulging anything, but it will not come any more quickly if you do that, right? But we do it because we feel like we need to feel like we're bringing the elevator, right? And when we're forced to recognize our impotence and our truly, right, insignificant dimensions in the world, right, sometimes we are forced to face that. This kind of looking at God as all-powerful, mysterious, something way beyond us. And he calls this state of being where we actually recognize our true dimensions, he calls it a state of starkness. And here, I want to just give you a quote from him. When he said he was diagnosed with this terrible illness, he said, after the initial shock, the main change in my state of mind was that, I can't think of a better way to put it, the background music suddenly stopped. It had always been there, the music of daily life that's constantly going, the music of infinite time and possibilities. Now suddenly it was gone, replaced by nothing, just silence. There you are, one little person sitting in the late summer sun with only a few things left to do, right? The music, right? This kind of rhythm that makes us feel like it's a fiction, but it makes us feel like there's something like moving us forward that's always got our back. And every once in a while, something can happen in life, some tragedy, some trauma, that can just force us into that, to face the void and realize that we're really just these infinitesimally small beings. Okay, so that seems to be the end of the book. With that knowledge, that understanding, just occupy your true dimensions. But then things get really interesting when we have a kind of postmodern second ending of the book. And now you might want to ask me to define the term postmodern. I hope you don't want to ask me to do that. For our, it's a really complicated concept and there's no simple definition, but for our purposes, I want to define it as the absence of a linear reading. And I know one postmodern joke, which is, what do you do when you cross a postmodernist with a mafia boss? What do you get? An offer you can't understand. Anyway. But if we want to understand it a little bit better, there is this wonderful postmodern work of fiction by John Fowles, the French Lieutenant's Woman, great picture, great movie with Meryl Streep. And we read this book, and he comes up with it, the book, he ends this book twice. He ends it, then he rewinds and ends it differently. And the book is about this man named Charles Smithson, who is a member of the aristocracy, and he is engaged to be married to Ernestina, who is of his social standing, and he's resigned to his fate. He's not excited about her, but this is the right thing to do. And then he falls in love with this wild outcast, whose name is Sarah, and she stirs up his desire for freedom. So how's he going to end this book? He has ending number 1, where he casts out Sarah, and he remains faithful to Ernestina, and he doesn't jeopardize his position in society. And then there's a second ending where Charles completely destroys his reputation, breaks off his marriage with Ernestina, and pursues Sarah. And when they asked John Fowles, why did you do this? Why did you write 2 different endings that are contradictory with one another? And he said, I wrote and printed 2 endings to the French Lieutenant's Woman entirely because from early in the first draft, I was torn between wishing to reward the protagonist, which he admits was his own surrogate, with the woman he loved, and wishing to deprive him of her. Okay, so basically what he's saying is, the human heart is very complex and contradictory. So if you want to really capture it, you can't just have one straightforward linear reading. You've got to give all sides of it. It's kind of like, and I find this often in the Bible, it's kind of like a Picasso painting, where you get a face with various angles. You can look at it from the front, you can look at it at the side. And I remember the first class I ever took in art history where they showed us a Renaissance painting that looks beautiful, and a Picasso where you've got an eye over there and a leg over there and a breast over there, and you don't, what is this? This is art? But when you realize where you're getting more emotion, you're getting this kind of surround emotion in this Picasso. And so there are biblical scholars who believe that we have much of that in the Bible as well. So should we not have something as complex as this when the Bible is giving its presentation on something as complex as theodicy? Why do bad things happen to good people? We can't tell it in one straightforward linear way. And so we've got a second ending to the book. Let's get back to the text. Source number 8. Vayomer Hashem el Eliphaz haTemani, Chara api b'cha. God turns to Job's friends and says, I'm angry at you. Why? Ki lo dibatem elai nechona ke'avdi Iyov. You have not spoken correctly, as has my servant Job. Job, who's been screaming at me for 38 chapters, he's right and you're wrong. Moreover, take 7 bulls, go to my servant Job, sacrifice a burnt offering, and let my servant pray for you. My servant, my servant, my servant, because you have not spoken correctly, as has my servant Job. And then all of his brothers and sisters and former friends comforted him. The Hebrew for that is vayenachamu oto. That same flexible verb that we saw earlier, meaning recanting, now means comforting, right? This is the complete opposite reaction to human suffering, where basically what God is saying is, I'm not calling upon you to recant your challenge of me. I'm supporting you, and I'm saying if anybody's right in this story, it's you, not my apologists who have said everything I do is right. You deserve comfort. Do you deserve an explanation? Well, not quite that far, but you do deserve an acknowledgement that you are suffering a terrible injustice. Okay, so we don't get the answers, we do get sympathy. Is there a hint of apology here? I would like to think so, that the person who cries foul actually gets the last word in this book. And here, this ending undermines the Akeda. Here is really the subversive sequel, by positing that a God-fearing person who is unjustly afflicted can say every word of protest that is on, in this case, his, but it could be her mind, and still retain that position as Tam and Yireh Elohim. And if you look in source number 9, the last time that Job speaks, I think there's a beautiful play on words here between Tam and Tamu, right? The words of Job are at an end, which can be alternatively understood as Job's words, as challenging as they are still perfect. They're still perfect. He is still the God-fearing person at the end of this book. And here again, the very end of the book, he dies, old and contented, zaken usiva yamim, and that's the last reference to Abraham, who dies with the same words, zaken v'savea. To his dying breath, Job remains the Abraham figure, despite the fact that he has done all of these incredible challenges against God. Sorry? Question? Okay. Now, I'm really moving toward conclusion here. I want to say the second ending of Job, unlike the first where it's this, right, this kind of starkness that Kugel was talking about, this undoing of the Akeda, I think, sits very, very nicely, very naturally with us, right? We're philosophers, we demand morality, we want some sense of order, of logic. When God seems to break the rules, we get agitated and we try to regain some sense of control by protesting, and we seek all kinds of new philosophical constructs, right? All these books, including a wonderful book written by Kushner, How Can God Be All Powerful and All Good at the Same Time? We want to make sense. We want to try. We want to use our power in order to feel some sense of control. And that's one ending. So again, but we have this other ending as well, and I think this ingenious book points to two types of responses. Both are legitimate, and both are enduring models for its readers. And I just want to end by saying in general, we are surrounded by suffering as human beings, as Jews. In any room, and the longer I live, the more I know this, in any room that we enter, we can't even imagine what people are carrying with them. If you just start asking people, you will find out almost immediately. And I think that with these two endings to the book of Job, we honor the people's different responses to it. Sometimes some of us, like Job in ending number 2, are relentless fighters, right? Practically we fight, theologically we fight. And sometimes some of us, like Job in ending number 1, and like Abraham at the Akeda, silently accept our fate with silence, with starkness, with humble submission to things that are simply beyond our grasp. And I think built into the Jewish calendar, we have certain days that are actually put in to induce that sense of smallness. The Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, where we are meant to feel our true dimensions. Having come from Israel just this week, Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance for all the fallen soldiers and victims of terror, this sense of silence, right, where we actually listen to a siren and keep ourselves quiet just to feel our sense of we are not in control of this. It's something we simply have to bear. I think what we've got here, right, is both of this. And I just want to end by saying that God never explains why these things happen, and apparently even in a book as kind of shocking as the book of Job, we don't get that. And I think it's probably best to adopt Heschel's famous statement, which is the Bible, he says, is not man's theology, it's God's anthropology. Really what the Bible is, we can't really learn what God is, but we can learn about who we are. from the Bible. How does God want us to be? And I think these combined stories of the Akeda and Job have let us know that as humans, sometimes it's appropriate for us to stand in silent submission. And sometimes it's appropriate for us to flex our intellectual and spiritual muscles to protest and demand. And with apologies to Heschel, if I could indulge just one moment of theological speculation, I'd like to imagine God smiling down on us no matter which mode we choose, and saying approvingly, now I know that you are God-fearing. Ataya dati ki yir'e Elohim atem. Amen. Shalom, shalom.